The Duke of Ashford stood before his household, his voice cold as winter frost. "You are only a wife in name," he declared, each word a blade meant to sever any hope of affection. Lady Eleanor Hartley had entered this marriage with trembling optimism, believing duty might blossom into something warmer. But as the Duke turned his back, dismissing her as one might a servant, she understood the truth. She had been purchased, not chosen. What Eleanor did not know, what none of them knew, was that within a year, those same children who watched her humiliation would fall to their knees, begging her to save the man who had cast her aside. For sometimes, the heart we refuse to see becomes the only one capable of saving us. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it's traveled. The morning of Eleanor Hartley's wedding dawned with the kind of grey English sky that promised neither rain nor sunshine, merely existence. She stood before the tall windows of Hartley Manor, watching the mist curl around the ancient oaks that lined the drive, and felt the weight of her future settle upon her shoulders like a cloak made of iron. "You look beautiful, my dear," her mother said from behind her, though the words carried no warmth. Lady Hartley had been arranging this marriage for 2 years, ever since the Hartley fortunes had begun their quiet, devastating decline. "The Duke of Ashford is a most advantageous match." Eleanor turned from the window, her wedding gown rustling with the movement. It was a magnificent creation of ivory silk and Brussels lace, worth more than her family could afford, paid for by the Duke himself. Everything about this day had been paid for by the Duke. The flowers, the breakfast, the musicians who would play at the wedding breakfast. Even Eleanor herself had been paid for, though no one spoke of it in such crude terms. Does the Duke seem pleased with the arrangement?" Eleanor asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Her mother's expression flickered with something that might have been pity, quickly suppressed. "The Duke of Ashford is not a man given to displays of emotion, Eleanor. He requires a wife to manage his household and provide companionship to his children. You will fulfill that role admirably." Companionship to his children, not to him. Eleanor had met the Duke only 3 times before today, each encounter formal and brief. He was a man of perhaps 35 years, tall and imposing, with dark hair silvered at the temples and eyes the color of a winter sea. His first wife had died 4 years ago, leaving him with 3 children, Margaret, aged 10, Thomas, aged 8, and little Catherine, barely 5. The Duke had mourned appropriately, then set about finding a replacement with the same efficiency he applied to managing his vast estates. Eleanor was 22, well-educated, and from a respectable family fallen on hard times. She was also, as her mother frequently reminded her, running out of time to make a suitable match. The Duke's offer had been generous, enough to save the Hartleys from complete ruin. Eleanor's father had signed the marriage contract with shaking hands and tears in his eyes, though whether from relief or shame, Eleanor could not say. The ceremony took place in the chapel at Ashford Hall, the Duke's principal seat in Derbyshire. The ancient stone building was filled with the cream of English society, all come to witness the Duke's remarriage. Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her eyes fixed on the man waiting at the altar. The Duke stood rigid as a statue, his expression unreadable. When she reached him, he did not smile. He simply took her hand, his grip firm and impersonal, and turned to face the vicar. The vows were spoken, the ring was placed, the register was signed. And through it all, the Duke did not once meet her eyes with anything resembling warmth. The wedding breakfast was a grand affair in Ashford Hall's state dining room. Eleanor sat beside her new husband at the head of the table, acutely aware of the distance he maintained between them despite their proximity. He spoke when necessary, responding to toasts and congratulations with practiced courtesy, but he did not speak to her. Not really. When he did address her, it was with the same tone he might use with his steward. "You will find your apartments in the East Wing," he said during a lull in conversation. "Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, will show you everything you need to know. The children take their meals in the nursery. You may visit them at appropriate hours." "I should like to meet them properly," Eleanor ventured, trying to find some common ground. "I hope we might become friends." The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "They have a governess for their education and a nurse for their care. Your role is to manage the household and represent the family at social functions. I trust that will keep you sufficiently occupied." Eleanor felt the words like a slap, but she kept her composure. Around them, the wedding guests laughed and celebrated, oblivious to the chill emanating from the head table. That evening, after the last guests had departed, Eleanor found herself alone in her new apartments. They were beautiful, decorated in shades of cream and gold, with windows overlooking the formal gardens. But they were also clearly separate from the Duke's rooms, connected only by a locked door that Eleanor suspected would remain permanently closed. Mrs. Blackwood, a stern woman of perhaps 50 years, had shown her through the rooms with brisk efficiency. "His Grace keeps regular hours," she explained. "He breakfasts at 7, works in his study until luncheon, rides in the afternoon and dines at 8. He does not like to be disturbed during his work hours. The household accounts are kept in the morning room. You'll review them each Monday. Any questions about the running of the house should be directed to me first." "And the children?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Blackwood's expression softened slightly. "Poor lambs. They've had a difficult time of it since their mother passed. Miss Margaret tries to be brave, but she's only a child herself. Master Thomas has grown wild without proper guidance, and little Miss Catherine barely speaks anymore." She caught herself, as if remembering her place. "But that's not your concern, Your Grace. They have Miss Pemberton to look after them." But it was Eleanor's concern. She had not entered this marriage expecting love. She was not so foolish. But she had hoped for purpose, for a place where she might be useful. If the Duke would not allow her into his life, perhaps she might find meaning with his children. The following morning, Eleanor rose early and made her way to the nursery wing. She found the children at breakfast, supervised by a young woman who introduced herself as Miss Pemberton, their governess. The children looked up at Eleanor's entrance with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Margaret, the eldest, had her father's dark hair and serious grey eyes. She stood and curtsied with perfect formality. "Good morning, Your Grace." "Please call me Eleanor," she said gently, taking a seat at the table. "I thought we might become acquainted." Thomas, a sturdy boy with unruly brown hair, regarded her with open skepticism. "Father said you're here to manage the house, not us." "Your father is quite right," Eleanor agreed carefully, "but I should still like to know you. What are you studying with Miss Pemberton?" Little Catherine, a tiny thing with blonde curls and enormous blue eyes, said nothing. She simply stared at Eleanor with an expression of such profound sadness that Eleanor felt her heart constrict. The conversation was stilted and brief. Miss Pemberton clearly viewed Eleanor's presence as an intrusion, and the children took their cue from her. After 20 minutes, Eleanor excused herself, feeling more alone than she had in her empty apartments. The days settled into a pattern. Eleanor managed the household with quiet efficiency, reviewing accounts, consulting with Mrs. Blackwood, planning menus, and overseeing the staff. She attended church on Sundays, sitting beside the Duke in the family pew, both of them maintaining the fiction of a united front. She dined with him each evening, enduring meals filled with silence or, worse, his distant politeness. The Duke was not cruel. He was simply absent. He provided everything she might need materially, but gave nothing of himself. He did not ask about her day, her thoughts, her feelings. He did not seem to see her as a person at all, merely as a function, the Duchess of Ashford, a role to be filled. 3 weeks after the wedding, Eleanor encountered the children in the gardens. She had taken to walking there in the afternoons, finding solace in the beauty of the roses and the privacy of the hedge maze. She came upon them unexpectedly. Margaret reading beneath an oak tree, Thomas climbing its branches, and Catherine sitting in the grass, making chains from daisies. "May I join you?" Eleanor asked. Margaret looked uncertain, but she nodded. Eleanor sat beside her, careful not to intrude too much. "What are you reading?" "Pride and Prejudice," Margaret said quietly. "It was my mother's favorite." "It's one of mine as well," Eleanor said truthfully. "Have you reached the part where Elizabeth visits Pemberley yet?" Margaret's eyes lit up slightly, and for the next half hour they discussed the book. Thomas eventually climbed down from his tree to listen, and even Catherine moved closer, though she still did not speak. It was the Duke who ended the moment. He appeared on the path, his expression thunderous. "Margaret, Thomas, Catherine, return to the nursery at once." The children scattered like frightened birds. The Duke turned to Eleanor, his voice cold. "I would appreciate it if you would not interfere with the children's routine. You were merely overstepping your bounds," he interrupted. "The children have their governess. They do not need you attempting to replace their mother." The words struck deep, but Eleanor lifted her chin. "I have no intention of replacing anyone, Your Grace. I simply thought—" "That is the problem, madam. You think too much about matters that do not concern you." He turned on his heel and strode away, leaving Eleanor standing alone among the roses. That night, lying in her solitary bed, Eleanor finally allowed herself to cry. She had known this marriage would be difficult, but she had not anticipated this complete rejection, this utter loneliness. She was a wife in name only, a duchess without purpose, a stepmother forbidden from mothering. But Eleanor Hartley, now Eleanor Ashford, had not survived 22 years of her mother's sharp tongue and her family's declining fortunes without developing a core of steel beneath her gentle exterior. If the Duke would not allow her into his life, she would find her own purpose. She would learn everything about running this vast estate. She would make herself indispensable, not through affection, but through competence. And perhaps in time, she might find a way to reach those 3 lonely children who needed someone to see them, even if their father could not. What Eleanor did not know, as she dried her tears and steeled her resolve, was that fate had already set in motion the events that would transform everything. In the Duke's study, a letter lay unopened on his desk. A letter that would soon bring darkness to Ashford Hall, and with it the terrible choice that would reveal where true strength resided. The autumn social season brought with it the obligation that Eleanor had been dreading, the Ashford Ball. It was a tradition stretching back generations, held each October to celebrate the harvest and reaffirm the Duke's position as the most prominent landowner in Derbyshire. This year, it would also serve as Eleanor's formal introduction to society as the new Duchess of Ashford. For 3 weeks, the household had been in a state of controlled chaos. Eleanor had thrown herself into the preparations with determined focus, consulting with Mrs. Blackwood on every detail. The ballroom was cleaned until the parquet floors gleamed like glass. The crystal chandeliers were lowered and each prism polished by hand. Flowers were ordered from the hothouses, hundreds of white roses and autumn dahlias. The menu was planned with meticulous care. A supper featuring pheasant, venison and delicacies from London. Eleanor had hoped that her efforts might earn some acknowledgement from the Duke, some small sign of approval. Instead, he had merely nodded when she presented the plans to him, saying only, "I trust you will not embarrass the family." The night of the ball arrived with unseasonable warmth. Eleanor dressed in a gown of deep sapphire silk that brought out the blue of her eyes, her dark hair arranged in an elegant style adorned with diamonds, the Ashford diamonds brought to her room by Mrs. Blackwood, with the terse explanation that His Grace insists the Duchess wear the family jewels. When Eleanor descended the grand staircase, she found the Duke waiting in the entrance hall. He was magnificent in his evening clothes, every inch the aristocrat. For a moment, as his eyes swept over her, Eleanor thought she saw something flicker in their depths. Surprise, perhaps, or appreciation. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "You look presentable," he said flatly. "Remember, you are representing the Ashford name tonight. Conduct yourself accordingly." The guests began arriving at 8 o'clock. Eleanor stood beside the Duke in the receiving line, her face aching from maintaining a smile as they greeted what seemed like half of England. The Duke introduced her with mechanical courtesy. "My wife, the Duchess of Ashford." Nothing more. No warmth, no pride, just a statement of fact. Among the guests was Lady Beatrice Thornton, a striking woman of perhaps 30, with auburn hair and a figure that her emerald gown displayed to advantage. When she reached the Duke, her greeting was markedly warmer than those that had come before. "Your Grace," she purred, extending her hand. The Duke took it, and Eleanor noticed that he held it a fraction longer than necessary. "Lady Beatrice, how delightful to see you." Lady Beatrice's eyes slid to Eleanor with barely concealed disdain. "And this must be the new Duchess? How quaint." Eleanor felt the insult but kept her composure. "Lady Beatrice, welcome to Ashford Hall." As the evening progressed, Eleanor began to notice things that made her stomach twist with unease. The Duke danced the opening waltz with her. Obligation demanded it, but his hold was formal, his expression distant. When the dance ended, he escorted her to the side of the ballroom and promptly disappeared. Eleanor watched as he made his way through the crowd, stopping here and there to speak with various guests until he reached Lady Beatrice. The way they spoke to each other was different. The Duke actually smiled, a real smile that transformed his austere features. Lady Beatrice touched his arm with casual familiarity, leaning close to whisper something that made him laugh. It was a sound Eleanor had never heard from him, and it cut deeper than any harsh word. "Don't let it trouble you, dear," said a voice beside her. Eleanor turned to find an elderly woman with kind eyes and a shrewd expression. "Lady Agatha Pemberton at your service. I'm Miss Pemberton's aunt. The governess, you know." "Lady Agatha," Eleanor said, grateful for the friendly face. "Are you enjoying the evening?" "As much as one can enjoy watching a train wreck in slow motion," Lady Agatha said dryly. She nodded toward the Duke and Lady Beatrice. "He's making rather a spectacle of himself, isn't he?" Eleanor's cheeks burned. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Of course you do. You're not blind, child." Lady Agatha sipped her champagne. Beatrice Thornton was his mistress before his first wife died. Some say she expected to become the second Duchess. Instead, he chose you, a practical choice, a financial arrangement. Beatrice has never forgiven either of you for it. The words confirmed Eleanor's worst suspicions. She watched as the Duke led Lady Beatrice onto the dance floor for the second time that evening. They moved together with the ease of long familiarity, and the whispers around the ballroom grew louder. "Why would he humiliate me this way?" Eleanor whispered. Lady Agatha's expression softened. "Because he's a fool, my dear. A proud, wounded fool who thinks that keeping his heart locked away will protect him from further pain. But that's no excuse for treating you so shabbily." The evening grew worse. The Duke danced with Lady Beatrice 3 times, a shocking breach of etiquette that set tongues wagging throughout the ballroom. He did not dance with Eleanor again. When supper was announced, he escorted Lady Beatrice to the dining room, while Eleanor was left to walk in with Lord Pemberton, Lady Agatha's elderly husband. At the supper table, Eleanor found herself seated far from the Duke, who had Lady Beatrice at his right hand. She watched as they conversed intimately, as Lady Beatrice laughed at his remarks and touched his hand across the table. The other guests noticed too. Eleanor could feel their pitying glances, hear the whispers behind fans and gloved hands. It was during the dessert course that the final humiliation came. Lord Ashford's sister, Lady Caroline Ashford Grey, rose from her seat with a glass of champagne in hand. She was a formidable woman of 40, known for her sharp tongue and her devotion to her brother. "I should like to propose a toast," Lady Caroline announced, her voice carrying across the dining room, "to my dear brother, the Duke of Ashford, who has always known his duty to his family and his name." Glasses were raised. Eleanor lifted hers, expecting the usual platitudes about happiness and prosperity. But Lady Caroline was not finished. "My brother's first marriage was a love match, a union of hearts as well as names. We all mourned the loss of dear Charlotte, a true duchess in every sense." Her eyes found Eleanor across the table, cold and assessing. "His second marriage, of course, serves a different purpose, a practical arrangement, a business transaction. We must all do our duty, mustn't we? Even when it requires sacrifices." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor felt every eye in the room turn to her, saw the mixture of pity and schadenfreude on the faces around her. The Duke did nothing. He simply sat there, his expression unreadable, and allowed his sister's words to hang in the air like poison. It was Lady Beatrice who broke the silence, her laughter bright and cruel. "How refreshingly honest, Lady Caroline, so rare in our circles." She turned to the Duke, her hand covering his on the table. "But surely even practical arrangements have their compensations." The Duke's fingers curled around Lady Beatrice's, and Eleanor felt something inside her shatter. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Every face turned toward her. "If you'll excuse me," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the tears burning behind her eyes. "I find I am unwell." She walked from the dining room with her head high, refusing to run despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. Behind her she heard the immediate explosion of whispered conversation, but she did not look back. She could not bear to see if the Duke had even noticed her departure. Eleanor made it to her apartments before the tears came. She tore the Ashford diamonds from her throat and hair, letting them scatter across her dressing table. The sapphire gown suddenly felt like a costume, a beautiful lie. She had played the role of Duchess, had done everything expected of her, and it had meant nothing. A soft knock came at her door. "Your Grace!" It was Mrs. Blackwood. "I've brought you some tea." Eleanor opened the door to find the housekeeper's stern face softened with sympathy. "The guests are leaving," Mrs. Blackwood said quietly. "Lady Agatha asked me to tell you that you conducted yourself with great dignity." "Dignity," Eleanor repeated bitterly. "What good is dignity when I have been made a laughingstock in my own home?" Mrs. Blackwood set down the tea tray and turned to face Eleanor directly. "If I may speak plainly, Your Grace, His Grace is behaving abominably, but you must not let them see you broken. Women like Lady Beatrice and Lady Caroline, they want you to crumble. Don't give them the satisfaction." Eleanor sank into a chair, exhaustion overwhelming her. "What am I to do, Mrs. Blackwood? I am trapped in a marriage to a man who despises me, in a house where I am not wanted." "You survive," Mrs. Blackwood said firmly, "and then, when you're strong enough, you find a way to live." After the housekeeper left, Eleanor sat alone in the darkness, listening to the sounds of carriages departing, of the ball ending, of her humiliation becoming the gossip that would spread through every drawing-room in England. She thought of her parents, of how they had sold her into this golden cage. She thought of the Duke, dancing with his mistress while his wife stood alone. She thought of those 3 lonely children, locked away in their nursery, as trapped as she was, and she made a decision. She would not break. She would not give them that victory. But neither would she remain here, a ghost in her own home, waiting for scraps of acknowledgement that would never come. Tomorrow she would write to Lady Agatha and accept the older woman's earlier offer to visit her London townhouse. She would leave Ashford Hall, leave the Duke to his mistress and his cold, empty life. She would find her own path, even if it meant walking it alone. What Eleanor did not know, as she finally fell into exhausted sleep, was that her departure would set in motion a chain of events that would bring the proud Duke of Ashford to his knees. For sometimes we only recognize the value of what we have when we are faced with losing it forever. Eleanor departed Ashford Hall 3 days after the disastrous ball, taking only her personal maid Susan and 2 trunks of clothing. She left no note for the Duke. What could she possibly say that he would care to read? Instead, she informed Mrs. Blackwood of her destination, and asked that the housekeeper convey her departure to His Grace at an appropriate time. "He's locked himself in his study since the ball," Mrs. Blackwood said quietly as she helped Eleanor into the carriage. "Hasn't spoken to anyone, not even Lady Caroline. The children have been asking for you." Eleanor's heart clenched. In the 3 days since the ball, she had visited the nursery each morning, finding solace in Margaret's quiet intelligence, Thomas's gradually warming demeanour, and even Catherine's silent presence. The little girl had actually taken Eleanor's hand the previous afternoon, a small gesture that had meant everything. "Tell them I shall write," Eleanor promised, "and Mrs. Blackwood, please watch over them." The journey to London took 2 days. Lady Agatha's townhouse in Mayfair was elegant but comfortable, reflecting its owner's practical nature. The elderly woman greeted Eleanor with a warm embrace and no questions, simply showing her to a lovely suite of rooms overlooking the square. "You'll stay as long as you need," Lady Agatha said firmly, "and when you're ready to talk, I'll listen. Until then, rest." For the first week, Eleanor did little but sleep and read. The exhaustion she felt went beyond the physical. It was the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been holding themselves together through sheer will. In Lady Agatha's home, she finally felt safe enough to fall apart, but Eleanor was not made for prolonged melancholy. By the second week, she began joining Lady Agatha for breakfast, then for afternoon calls. Lady Agatha moved in intellectual circles quite different from the aristocratic gatherings Eleanor had endured at Ashford Hall. Her drawing-room hosted writers, reformers and thinkers, people who valued ideas over titles. It was at one of these gatherings that Eleanor met Dr. Elias Reed. He arrived late to Lady Agatha's Tuesday salon, apologizing for his tardiness with an American accent that immediately marked him as an outsider in London society. "Dr. Reed has just returned from establishing a medical clinic in the East End," Lady Agatha explained, introducing him to the assembled guests. "He's been doing remarkable work with the poor." Dr. Reed was perhaps 30 years old, tall and lean, with brown hair that refused to stay properly combed and warm hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He was not handsome in the classical sense, but there was something compelling about his face, an openness, an intensity of purpose that drew the eye. When he was introduced to Eleanor, he bowed with more enthusiasm than grace. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure. I confess I don't often find myself in such elevated company." "Please call me Eleanor," she said, surprising herself. "I find I'm rather tired of titles." His eyes lit with interest. "Then you must call me Elias. Though I warn you, Lady Agatha has likely invited me to shock her more conservative guests with tales of poverty and disease. I'm not known for my drawing-room manners." He was right. Over tea, Dr. Reed spoke passionately about the conditions in London's slums, about children dying of preventable diseases, about the desperate need for medical care among those who could not afford private physicians. Some of the guests looked scandalized, but Eleanor found herself leaning forward, fascinated. "Surely the government provides some assistance?" she asked. "The government provides workhouses and condemnation," Elias said bluntly. "What's needed is practical help, clinics, education, sanitation. But such work requires funding, and most of society prefers to pretend the poor don't exist." After the other guests departed, Lady Agatha invited Eleanor and Elias to stay for dinner. Over roasted chicken and wine, the conversation continued, ranging from medical advances to social reform to literature. Eleanor discovered that Elias had read widely, that he quoted Shakespeare and Wordsworth as easily as he discussed surgical techniques. "You're not what I expected of a duchess," Elias said frankly as the evening drew to a close. "Most of your class seem to view the world beyond their estates as an inconvenient abstraction." "Perhaps that's because most of my class have never had to worry about money," Eleanor replied. My family's circumstances were reduced. I understand what it means to fear the future. Something shifted in Elias's expression, a new respect, a recognition of shared experience. Then you understand why the work matters. I do, Eleanor said softly. I wish I could help. Can you organize? Elias asked immediately. Can you manage accounts, coordinate volunteers, write letters to potential donors? Because if so, the clinic desperately needs someone with those skills. My partner, Dr. Sarah Chen, and I are excellent physicians, but hopeless administrators. Eleanor felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. I managed an entire ducal household. I believe I could manage a clinic. And so began Eleanor's transformation. Each morning, she traveled to the East End with Lady Agatha's blessing, working alongside Elias and Dr. Chen to bring order to the chaotic clinic. She organized the medical supplies, established a system for patient records, and began writing letters to wealthy potential donors, using her title shamelessly to open doors. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking. Eleanor saw poverty she had never imagined, suffering that made her own troubles seem trivial. But she also saw hope. Children recovering from illness, mothers learning to read, families receiving care that might save their lives. Elias proved to be an extraordinary teacher. He explained medical procedures as they worked, answered her questions with patience, and treated her as an equal partner rather than a titled lady playing at charity. He also made her laugh, something Eleanor had almost forgotten how to do. You have a gift for this, he told her one afternoon as they reviewed the month's accounts. The donations have tripled since you began writing letters, and the volunteers actually show up on time now that you've organized the schedule. Eleanor felt herself flush with pleasure at the praise. It's satisfying to be useful. At Ashford Hall, I was merely decorative. Elias looked at her seriously. The Duke is a fool. You don't know anything about my marriage, Eleanor said, startled. I know that any man who would make you feel useless is an idiot, Elias replied bluntly. You're brilliant, Eleanor. You're compassionate and organized and brave enough to come to the East End every day when most women of your station won't even acknowledge its existence. If your husband can't see that, he's blind. Eleanor found herself blinking back tears, but these were different from the tears she had shed at Ashford Hall. These were tears of gratitude, of recognition, of feeling seen for the first time in her life. As autumn turned to winter, Eleanor's life in London took on a comfortable rhythm. She worked at the clinic 4 days a week, attended Lady Agatha's salons, and began to build friendships based on shared interests rather than social obligation. She wrote weekly letters to the children at Ashford Hall, receiving careful replies from Margaret that hinted at loneliness but never directly criticized their father. The Duke himself sent only one communication, a brief note inquiring whether she required additional funds. Eleanor replied with equal brevity that Lady Agatha was providing for her needs. She did not ask when he expected her to return. He did not ask when she planned to do so. It was in early December that everything shifted. Eleanor and Elias were working late at the clinic, preparing for a Christmas charity drive, when he suddenly set down his pen and looked at her directly. Eleanor, I need to tell you something. And I'm going to make a mess of it because I'm better with scalpels than words. Her heart began to beat faster. What is it? I've come to care for you, he said simply, more than I should, given that you're married. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel it. You're the most remarkable woman I've ever met, and spending time with you has become the best part of my days. Eleanor sat frozen, a dozen emotions warring within her. She cared for Elias too, had come to depend on his friendship, his respect, his ability to make her feel valued. But she was married, bound by vows she had taken seriously, even if her husband had not. Elias, I'm not asking you to do anything improper, he interrupted gently. I know you're a woman of honor. I just needed you to know that you are seen, Eleanor. You are valued, and if circumstances were different, He trailed off, the unspoken possibilities hanging between them. Before Eleanor could respond, Dr. Chen burst into the office, her face pale. "Eleanor, a messenger just arrived from Derbyshire. It's about the Duke." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. "What about him?" Dr. Chen handed her a telegram. Eleanor's hands shook as she read the brief message from Mrs. Blackwood. "His Grace gravely ill. Fever. Doctors baffled. Children asking for you. Please come." Elias read over her shoulder. "You have to go." "I know," Eleanor whispered. The Duke had humiliated her, rejected her, treated her as less than nothing. But he was still her husband, and those children, those lonely, frightened children, needed her. She looked up at Elias, seeing understanding in his eyes. "Will you come with me? As a physician, I mean. If the doctors there are baffled—" "I'll pack my medical bag," he said immediately. "We can take the night train." As Eleanor hurried back to Lady Agatha's townhouse to prepare for the journey, her mind raced. She was returning to Ashford Hall, to the place of her greatest humiliation. But she was returning as a different woman, stronger, more certain of her own worth. Whatever awaited her there, she would face it not as the desperate girl who had married for duty, but as the woman she had become. And perhaps, just perhaps, this crisis would finally reveal what truly lay beneath the Duke's cold exterior. The train journey back to Derbyshire felt interminable. Eleanor sat in the first-class compartment with Elias across from her, watching the winter landscape blur past the windows. She had left Ashford Hall as a broken woman. She was returning as someone entirely different. "Tell me about his symptoms," Elias said, pulling out a notebook. His transformation into the focused physician helped steady Eleanor's nerves. "Mrs. Blackwood's telegram said fever, but the doctors are baffled. That suggests it's not something common, not influenza or pneumonia that they would recognize immediately." "How long has he been ill?" Eleanor calculated quickly. "The telegram was sent yesterday, but it must have been urgent for Mrs. Blackwood to contact me. Perhaps a week, maybe more if he concealed it initially." Elias made notes, his expression thoughtful. "We'll need a complete history. What he's eaten, where he's travelled, any injuries or exposures. The fact that multiple doctors are baffled suggests either something rare or something they're not looking for." They arrived at Ashford Hall near midnight. The great house blazed with lights despite the late hour, and Eleanor's stomach clenched with apprehension as the carriage rolled up the drive. Mrs. Blackwood met them at the door, her usually stern face drawn with worry. "Your Grace, thank God you've come. He's been asking for you. In his delirium, you understand. He doesn't know what he's saying." "This is Dr. Elias Reed from London," Eleanor said quickly. "He's an excellent physician. Take him to the Duke immediately. I'll go to the children." But before Mrs. Blackwood could respond, 3 small figures appeared at the top of the staircase. Margaret, Thomas and Catherine stood in their nightclothes, their faces pale and frightened. When Catherine saw Eleanor, she broke free from her siblings and ran down the stairs, throwing herself into Eleanor's arms. "You came back," the little girl whispered, the first words Eleanor had ever heard her speak. "I prayed you would come back." Eleanor held the trembling child close, her eyes meeting Margaret's over Catherine's blonde curls. The older girl's composure cracked, tears streaming down her face. "He's dying," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "The doctors say there's nothing more they can do. He's been calling for Mother, for his first wife, and we thought he would die without ever—" She couldn't finish. Thomas, trying to be brave, scrubbed at his eyes with his fists. "We wrote to you, but the letters came back. Father said you weren't to be disturbed in London." Eleanor felt fury rise in her chest. The Duke had intercepted the children's letters, but she pushed it aside. "I'm here now," she said firmly, "and I've brought an excellent doctor from London. Dr. Reed will help your father." She settled the children back in the nursery with Miss Pemberton, promising to return with news, then hurried to the Duke's chambers. The scene that greeted her was grim. The Duke lay in his massive bed, his face flushed with fever, his breathing laboured. Two elderly physicians stood nearby, looking helpless, and beside the bed, holding the Duke's hand, sat Lady Beatrice Thornton. Beatrice looked up at Eleanor's entrance, her expression shifting from surprise to hostility. "What are you doing here?" "I live here," Eleanor said coldly. "Or had you forgotten? Please leave. The Duke needs proper medical care." "I've been nursing him for days," Beatrice snapped. "Where were you? Off in London, abandoning your duties." "Abandoning?" Eleanor's voice could have cut glass. "I left because my husband publicly humiliated me at our own ball, showing more affection to his mistress than to his wife. But I'm here now, and you are leaving." Elias stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "Ladies, this isn't helping my patient. Everyone out except the Duchess." "I'm staying," Beatrice insisted. "You're not family," Elias said bluntly. "Out, now." The two elderly physicians looked affronted at this American upstart, but something in Elias's manner made them comply. Beatrice left with a venomous glare at Eleanor, and suddenly the room was quiet, except for the Duke's laboured breathing. Elias began his examination immediately, checking the Duke's pulse, listening to his heart and lungs, examining his eyes and skin. Eleanor stood nearby, watching her husband's face. Even in illness he was handsome, but the fever had stripped away his usual cold control. He looked vulnerable, almost young. "Eleanor," the Duke murmured, his eyes still closed. "Eleanor, I'm sorry, so sorry. Should have seen." Eleanor's breath caught. Elias glanced at her, then continued his examination. "How long has he been like this?" "Mrs. Blackwood said about a week, but I suspect longer." Elias pulled back the Duke's nightshirt, revealing his torso. There, on his left side, was an angry red wound, partially healed, but clearly infected. "There's your answer. This wound is septic. The infection has spread to his blood." "What caused it?" "Looks like a puncture wound." "Hunting accident, perhaps? A fall onto something sharp?" Elias was already opening his medical bag, pulling out instruments and bottles. "The good news is that if we act quickly, we can save him. The bad news is that the treatment will be painful, and he'll need constant nursing for weeks." "Tell me what to do," Eleanor said immediately. Over the next hours, Elias worked with focused intensity. He reopened the wound, drained the infection, cleaned it with carbolic acid, a new antiseptic technique he'd learned in America, and stitched it properly. The Duke thrashed and cried out in his delirium, and Eleanor held his hand, murmuring soothing words she didn't know she remembered. As dawn broke, the Duke's fever finally began to drop. Elias sat back, exhausted. He'll live, but he needs round-the-clock care for at least 2 weeks. The wound must be cleaned and dressed twice daily, and he'll need to be kept quiet and still so it can heal properly. "I'll do it," Eleanor said. "Eleanor, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." She looked at her husband's sleeping face. "He's my husband, whatever else he may be, and those children need their father." Elias studied her for a long moment. "You're extraordinary, you know that?" "I'm practical," Eleanor corrected. "Now go rest. You've been up all night." The news of Eleanor's return and the Duke's improvement spread through the household like wildfire. By mid-morning, Lady Caroline arrived, sweeping into the sick room with her usual imperious manner. "I've come to nurse my brother," she announced. "That won't be necessary," Eleanor said calmly, not looking up from where she was preparing a fresh bandage. "I'm managing his care." "You? You abandoned him?" Eleanor finally met Lady Caroline's eyes, and the older woman actually took a step back at what she saw there. "I left because your brother treated me abominably and you helped him do it. But I'm back now, and I'm the Duchess of Ashford. This is my home, my husband, and my responsibility. If you wish to help, you may assist with the children. Otherwise, please leave." Lady Caroline opened her mouth, closed it, and left without another word. Lady Beatrice proved more persistent. She appeared that afternoon, insisting on seeing the Duke. Eleanor met her in the hallway outside the sick room. "He's sleeping," Eleanor said firmly, "and he needs rest, not visitors." "I have every right." "You have no rights here," Eleanor interrupted. "You are not his wife. You are not family. You are a guest in this house, and an unwelcome one at that. I suggest you return to your own estate." Beatrice's face twisted with rage. "He loves me. He's always loved me. You're just the broodmare he married for convenience." "Perhaps," Eleanor said quietly, "but I'm the one who's here, nursing him back to health. I'm the one his children trust. And I'm the one wearing his ring. You're the one he keeps hidden away like a shameful secret. If he truly loved you, Lady Beatrice, why didn't he marry you?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Beatrice had no answer. She turned and fled, and Eleanor heard her carriage leave an hour later. Over the following days, Eleanor barely left the Duke's side. She cleaned and dressed his wound, as Elias had taught her, spooned broth into him when he was lucid enough to swallow, and sat with him through the long nights when fever dreams made him restless. The children visited each afternoon, and Eleanor was touched by their devotion to their father. "He's not always cold," Margaret confided one evening as they sat by the Duke's bedside. "After Mother died, he was different for a while, sad but kind. Then he just closed off, like he was afraid to feel anything." "People protect themselves in different ways," Eleanor said gently. "Sometimes the strongest walls are built by the most frightened hearts." It was on the 8th day that the Duke finally woke fully lucid. His eyes opened, focused on Eleanor's face, and widened with shock. "You're here," he whispered hoarsely. "Where else would I be?" Eleanor replied, helping him drink some water. "London. I thought you'd left for good." "Your children needed you alive," Eleanor said simply. "That was reason enough to return." The Duke's eyes closed briefly, and when they opened again, they were suspiciously bright. "I've been a fool." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "You have." "Eleanor, Rest," she interrupted. "We'll talk when you're stronger. For now, just focus on healing." But as she turned to adjust his pillows, the Duke's hand caught hers. His grip was weak but insistent. "Thank you," he whispered, "for coming back, for saving my life, for being more than I deserved." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, feeling the weight of the moment. "You're welcome, Your Grace. Now sleep." As the Duke drifted off, Eleanor sat back in her chair, exhausted but oddly at peace. Outside the window, she could see Elias walking in the gardens, giving her space. She thought of his confession in London, of the life she might have had, but she had made her choice. She had returned to Ashford Hall, and in doing so, she had discovered something unexpected. Her own strength, her own worth, and perhaps, just perhaps, the possibility that even the coldest heart might learn to thaw. The Duke's recovery was slow but steady. By the end of the second week, he was able to sit up in bed and take solid food. By the third week, he was insisting, against Elias's medical advice, on getting out of bed for short periods. Throughout it all, Eleanor maintained her careful distance, nursing him with competent efficiency, but offering nothing more. The change in the household was palpable. The servants, who had once treated Eleanor with polite indifference, now showed her genuine respect. Mrs. Blackwood had become a staunch ally, and even the footman bowed with more deference. Eleanor had proven herself not merely decorative, but essential. The children had blossomed under her care. With the Duke incapacitated, Eleanor had taken full charge of the nursery, dismissing the ineffectual Miss Pemberton and taking over their education herself. Margaret revealed a sharp mind for mathematics and literature. Thomas, given proper attention, proved to be a natural scholar with a passion for history. And Catherine, no longer silent, chattered constantly, following Eleanor everywhere like a devoted shadow. It was during one of these lessons that the Duke first ventured from his chambers. Eleanor was reading A Midsummer Night's Dream aloud in the library, with all three children sprawled on the carpet around her, when she looked up to find him standing in the doorway. He was thinner, paler, but his eyes were clear and fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Father!" Catherine scrambled up and ran to him, but stopped short of embracing him, suddenly shy. The Duke knelt, carefully, favouring his healing side, and opened his arms. Catherine flew into them, and Eleanor watched as he held his youngest daughter close, his eyes closing with emotion. Margaret and Thomas joined them, and for a moment the Duke simply held his children, something Eleanor had never seen him do before. When he finally looked up at Eleanor, his expression was unreadable. "Might I join you?" "Of course," Eleanor said, her voice carefully neutral. "We're reading Shakespeare. Margaret is Hermia, Thomas is Lysander, and Catherine is Puck." "And you?" the Duke asked, settling into a chair with visible effort. "I'm everyone else," Eleanor said with a slight smile. "It's quite exhausting." They continued the reading, and Eleanor was surprised to hear the Duke join in, taking the part of Oberon with a rich, expressive voice she'd never heard him use. The children were delighted, and even Eleanor found herself relaxing into the shared pleasure of the story. Afterward, the Duke asked to speak with Eleanor privately. They walked slowly to his study, his first time there since his illness, and he gestured for her to sit. Instead of taking his place behind the massive desk, he sat in the chair beside hers, a subtle but significant shift. "I owe you an explanation," he began, "and an apology that no words can adequately convey." Eleanor waited, her hands folded in her lap. "When Charlotte died, I thought my life was over," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "We had married young for love, and losing her felt like losing half of myself. I swore I would never feel that way again, never give anyone the power to hurt me so deeply." "So you built walls?" Eleanor said quietly. "Yes, and when my financial situation required me to remarry, I chose you precisely because I thought I could keep you at a distance. You were young, from a family in need, and I convinced myself that a business arrangement would protect my heart." He laughed bitterly. "I was a coward and a fool." "You were grieving," Eleanor said, surprising herself with her compassion. "But grief doesn't excuse cruelty." "No, it doesn't." The Duke met her eyes directly. "I treated you abominably, Eleanor. I humiliated you publicly, denied you any role in my life or my children's lives, and drove you away. And then, when I was dying, all I could think about was how I had wasted the gift I'd been given." "What gift?" "You." The word was simple, but weighted with meaning. "You're extraordinary, Eleanor. You're intelligent, capable, kind, and stronger than I ever imagined. You saved my life, won my children's hearts, and managed my household with more grace than I've shown in years, and I was too blind and too afraid to see it." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "What are you saying, Your Grace?" "I'm saying that I want a chance to start again, not as the cold arrangement we began with, but as true partners. I'm saying that I've fallen in love with my own wife, and I'm terrified that I've destroyed any chance of her ever feeling the same for me." The words hung in the air between them. Eleanor's heart was racing, but her mind remained clear. She had dreamed of hearing such words once, but that was before the humiliation, before London, before she had discovered her own strength. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said honestly. "You broke something in me that night at the ball. You made me feel worthless." "I know," the Duke's voice cracked, "and I will spend the rest of my life trying to prove that you're not. Eleanor, I'm not asking for an answer now. I'm asking for a chance, a real chance, to earn your trust, your respect, and perhaps someday your affection." Before Eleanor could respond, a knock came at the door. Elias entered, his medical bag in hand, and the atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. The Duke's eyes moved between Eleanor and the American doctor, and something like understanding and fear crossed his face. "I've come to check your wound," Elias said, his tone professional, but his eyes on Eleanor. "And to say goodbye. I'm returning to London tomorrow." "So soon?" the Duke asked, and Eleanor heard the question beneath the question. "My work at the clinic can't wait any longer," Elias replied. "And you're well enough now that the local physicians can manage your care." He turned to Eleanor. "Might I speak with you before I go?" They walked together in the gardens, the winter air crisp and cold. Elias was quiet for a long time before finally speaking. "He's in love with you." Eleanor didn't deny it. He says he is. And you, how do you feel about him? Eleanor considered the question carefully. I don't know. I'm angry at him still, but I also see that he's trying to change, and the children need their father, a real father, not the cold stranger he's been. Elias stopped walking and turned to face her. Eleanor, I meant what I said in London. I care for you deeply. If you wanted to leave him, to seek an annulment or separation, I would support you. I would wait for you. The offer was tempting. A life in London, meaningful work at the clinic, a man who had seen her worth from the beginning. But even as she considered it, Eleanor knew her answer. I can't, she said softly. Not because I don't care for you, Elias. You've been a true friend, and you helped me find myself again. But I made vows, and those children, they've already lost one mother. I can't abandon them, even if it means sacrificing your own happiness. I don't know if it does, Eleanor admitted. The Duke I married was cold and cruel, but the man I've been nursing these past weeks, the man who holds his children and reads Shakespeare and admits his mistakes, perhaps he's someone I could learn to love. Or perhaps I'm a fool for giving him another chance. Elias smiled sadly. You're not a fool. You're loyal and brave and far too good for any of us. He took her hand and kissed it gently. But Eleanor, promise me something. Promise that if he hurts you again, if he returns to his old ways, you'll leave. You'll come back to London, to the clinic, to people who value you. Promise me you won't sacrifice yourself on the altar of duty. I promise, Eleanor said, and meant it. They said their goodbyes the next morning. The Duke, still weak but insistent on being present, thanked Elias formally for saving his life. Elias accepted with equal formality, but his eyes found Eleanor's one last time before he climbed into the carriage. The offer stands, he said quietly. Always. As the carriage disappeared down the drive, Eleanor felt the Duke's presence beside her. They stood together in silence, watching until the carriage was out of sight. He loves you, the Duke said finally. Yes, Eleanor replied honestly, and he's a good man. Will you go to him? Eleanor turned to face her husband. No, I'm staying here. But understand this, Your Grace. I'm not staying for you. I'm staying for Margaret, Thomas, and Catherine. I'm staying because I made vows that I take seriously, and I'm staying because I've discovered that I'm stronger than I knew, and I won't run from difficulty. Oh, what must I do to earn more than your duty? The Duke asked, his voice raw with vulnerability. You must become the man you were pretending to be just now, Eleanor said. The father who holds his children, the husband who sees his wife as a partner, the man who is brave enough to feel, even if it means risking pain. She paused. And you must send Lady Beatrice away permanently. I will not share my husband, even in name. She's already gone, the Duke said immediately. I sent her a letter 3 days ago, ending our association completely. There is only you, Eleanor. There will only ever be you. Eleanor studied his face, searching for deception and finding only earnest hope. Then we'll try, she said finally. We'll start again, slowly, and see what we might build together. The Duke's face transformed with a smile that made him look years younger. Thank you, he whispered. I won't fail you again. As they walked back to the house together, not touching, but side by side, Eleanor felt the first stirring of something that might in time become hope. She had left Ashford Hall broken and returned strong. She had been offered escape and chosen to stay. And now, perhaps, she might find that the life she had thought lost could be rebuilt into something even better. The children were waiting in the entrance hall, and Catherine ran to take Eleanor's hand. The Duke took Margaret's hand, and Thomas walked between them, and together, for the first time, they looked like a family. Spring came to Ashford Hall like a benediction. The gardens that had seemed so cold and forbidding during Eleanor's first months now burst with colour, daffodils and tulips, cherry blossoms and early roses. Eleanor walked among them on a warm April morning 6 months after the Duke's illness, and marvelled at how much had changed. The transformation had not been easy or immediate. The Duke, who had finally asked her to call him James, had kept his promise to change, but old habits died hard. There were moments when his natural reserve reasserted itself, when he retreated behind walls of formality. But now, when Eleanor gently pointed it out, he recognized it and tried again. They had begun taking breakfast together, just the two of them, before the children woke. These quiet morning hours had become Eleanor's favorite time of day. James would read her interesting passages from the newspaper, ask her opinion on estate matters, and share stories of his childhood that helped her understand the man he had become. "My father was cold," he had told her one morning. "Affection was seen as weakness in our family. When I married Charlotte, her warmth was like discovering fire for the first time. And when she died, I thought I had to return to ice to survive." "But ice preserves nothing," Eleanor had replied. "It only freezes things in place." The children had flourished beyond Eleanor's wildest hopes. Margaret, now 11, had revealed a talent for painting and spent hours in the conservatory capturing the gardens on canvas. James had commissioned a London art teacher to visit monthly, and Margaret's face when she learned of it had been radiant with joy. Thomas had discovered a passion for natural history. The estate gamekeeper, old Mr. Wickham, had taken the boy under his wing, teaching him to identify birds and track animals. James often joined them on their expeditions now, and Eleanor would watch from the windows as father and son walked together, their heads bent in conversation. Catherine, no longer silent, had become the house's little songbird. She sang constantly, while playing, while eating, while helping Eleanor arrange flowers. Her voice was pure and sweet, and James had hired a music teacher from Derby to nurture her gift. The first time Catherine had sung for her father, performing a simple folk song, James had wept openly. "I didn't know," he had said to Eleanor afterward. "I didn't know what I was missing by keeping them at a distance. I've wasted so much time." "Then don't waste any more," Eleanor had replied, taking his hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. The physical distance between them had closed gradually. First, James had begun taking Eleanor's arm when they walked. Then he had started sitting beside her in the drawing room, rather than across from her. Small touches became more frequent. A hand on her shoulder, fingers brushing as they passed a book, his palm at the small of her back as they entered a room together. But James had not pushed for more. He had not attempted to unlock the door between their bedchambers, had not pressed for intimacy beyond these careful gestures. Eleanor appreciated his patience, even as she found herself increasingly aware of him. The way his eyes followed her across a room, the warmth of his hand, the sound of his laugh when Thomas told a joke at dinner. Lady Agatha had visited in March, ostensibly to check on her niece's replacement as governess, but really to assess Eleanor's situation. She had watched James and Eleanor together with shrewd eyes, noting the small intimacies, the shared glances, the way they moved around each other like dancers learning a new pattern. "He's in love with you," Lady Agatha had said bluntly during a private tea. "Desperately, completely in love. The question is, how do you feel about him?" Eleanor had considered the question carefully. "I'm not sure I can call it love yet, but I care for him. I respect him. And I find myself wanting his company, missing him when he's away on estate business. Is that love or simply affection born of proximity?" "Does it matter what you call it?" Lady Agatha had replied. "The real question is whether you're happy." And Eleanor had realized with some surprise that she was, not in the passionate, all-consuming way she had once imagined happiness, but in a deeper, steadier way. She was content. She was valued. She had purpose and partnership and a family that needed her. The turning point came on a warm evening in late April. James had arranged a small dinner party. Nothing like the disastrous ball, just a few close neighbours and Lady Agatha, who had extended her visit. After dinner, Margaret had been persuaded to show her paintings. Thomas had given an enthusiastic lecture on the nesting habits of thrushes, and Catherine had sung. As the guests departed, full of praise for the children and compliments on the warmth of Ashford Hall, James had taken Eleanor's hand and led her to the terrace overlooking the gardens. "Do you remember the night of the ball?" he asked quietly. "I'm not likely to forget it," Eleanor replied, though without the bitterness that would once have colored her words. "I stood on this terrace that night after you left, and I told myself I was relieved. That you were too emotional, too demanding, that I was better off without your expectations." He turned to face her, his expression raw with emotion. "I was lying to myself, Eleanor. I was terrified because I had felt something when I saw you in that blue gown, something I had sworn never to feel again. So I pushed you away in the cruelest way possible." "James, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "When I was ill, delirious with fever, I dreamed I was drowning in ice. And then I heard your voice, felt your hand, and suddenly there was warmth. You pulled me back from the edge, Eleanor. Not just from death, but from the frozen half-life I'd been living." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "This was Charlotte's," he said, opening it to reveal a delicate ring set with sapphires and diamonds. "She would have wanted you to have it. But more than that, I want you to have it. Not as a replacement for her, but as a symbol of what we're building together." Eleanor looked at the ring, then at James's face. "What are we building?" "A real marriage," he said simply. "A partnership. A love that's different from what I had before, but no less real. Eleanor, I'm not asking you to love me. I know I haven't earned that yet. But I'm asking you to believe that I love you, that I see you, value you, and want to spend the rest of my life proving it." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. "I do believe you," she whispered. "And James, I think I'm already halfway to loving you back." The kiss, when it came, was gentle and sweet, full of promise rather than passion. It was a beginning, not a culmination, and that made it perfect. That night, for the first time, Eleanor unlocked the door between their chambers. James came to her slowly, carefully, treating her like something precious. Their union was tender and unhurried, a conversation in touch and breath that spoke of new beginnings and hard-won trust. Afterward, lying in James's arms, Eleanor thought of Elias and felt a pang of gratitude rather than regret. He had helped her find her strength, had shown her what it meant to be valued. But this partnership with James, this family they were building, this was where she belonged. The summer brought news from London. Elias had written to say that the clinic was thriving, thanks in part to a generous anonymous donation that had arrived in the spring. Eleanor smiled when she read the letter, knowing that James had made the donation after she had told him about her work there. "He's a good man," James had said when she thanked him, "and he helped save my life. More than that, he helped save you when I had broken you. I owe him a debt I can never fully repay." In August, Lady Caroline visited, her first time at Ashford Hall since Eleanor had ordered her out of the sick room. She arrived with visible trepidation, and Eleanor received her in the drawing room with cool politeness. "I've come to apologize," Lady Caroline said stiffly. "My behavior at the ball was inexcusable. I thought I was protecting my brother, but I was only helping him destroy his own happiness." Eleanor studied the older woman, seeing genuine remorse beneath the pride. "I accept your apology, Lady Caroline, and I hope we might start fresh." "You're more gracious than I deserve," Lady Caroline said. "James is a different man now, the man he was always meant to be. That's your doing." "No," Eleanor corrected gently. "It's his doing. I simply gave him a reason to try." By autumn, Ashford Hall had become known throughout the county as a place of warmth and welcome. Eleanor had instituted a tradition of monthly gatherings where neighbours could bring their children to play with Margaret, Thomas, and Catherine. She had also begun a small school on the estate for the tenants' children, teaching them to read and write herself when she could. James supported every initiative, often joining her in the schoolroom or helping organize the children's gatherings. He had become the father his children needed and the husband Eleanor had never dared hope for. One October evening, exactly 1 year after the disastrous ball, James arranged a private dinner for just the two of them. They ate in the small family dining room rather than the grand stateroom, and afterward he led her to the ballroom. "I owe you a dance," he said, as music began to play. He had arranged for musicians to be hidden in the gallery. "1 year ago I danced with everyone but my wife. Tonight I dance only with you." They waltzed together in the empty ballroom, and Eleanor felt the ghosts of that terrible night finally laid to rest. This was not the same man who had humiliated her. This was James, her husband, her partner, her love. "I'm happy," she said, surprised by the simple truth of it. "Truly happy." "So am I," James replied, pulling her closer. "You taught me that the bravest thing we can do is allow ourselves to feel, even when we're afraid. You taught me that love isn't weakness, it's the greatest strength we have." As winter approached again, Eleanor discovered she was with child. The joy in the house was palpable. The children were excited about a new sibling. James was tender and protective, and Eleanor felt a deep contentment settle over her. She wrote to Elias with the news, and his response was warm and genuine. "You've found your happiness, Eleanor. That's all I ever wanted for you. May your child inherit your strength and your husband's newfound capacity for love." On a cold December morning, Eleanor stood at the same window where she had stood on her wedding day, watching the mist curl around the oaks. But everything was different now. Behind her she heard James enter the room, felt his arms wrap around her, his hand resting gently on her growing belly. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I was wrong," Eleanor said. "I thought I was being planted in barren soil, that nothing could grow here. But I was wrong. We've both bloomed, not despite the difficulties, but because of them. We've grown into something stronger, something real." "You saved me," James said softly. "In every way a person can be saved." Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at the man she had married as a stranger and learned to love as a partner. "No," she said, "we saved each other." And as they stood together, watching their children play in the gardens below, Eleanor knew that she had found what she had been searching for all along. Not a perfect love, but a true one. Not a fairy tale, but something better. A real partnership, built on respect and trust and the courage to try again. She had been only a wife in name, but she had become so much more. A mother, a partner, a woman who had discovered her own strength and used it to heal not just a man, but an entire family. And in doing so, she had healed herself. And so, dear listeners, we come to the end of Eleanor and James's journey, a story of heartbreak transformed into hope, of walls crumbling to reveal the warmth beneath, and of a woman who discovered that true strength lies not in never falling, but in rising again with grace. Eleanor Hartley arrived at Ashford Hall as a transaction, a wife purchased to solve a problem. She was dismissed, humiliated, and told she was nothing more than a name on a marriage certificate. But she refused to accept that definition. She left, found her own worth in the streets of London's East End, and when duty called her back, she returned not as a broken supplicant, but as a woman who knew her own value. The Duke of Ashford learned the hardest lesson of all, that protecting your heart by freezing it only leads to a half-life, an existence without joy or meaning. It took nearly dying for him to understand that the wife he had dismissed was the very person who could save him, not just from illness, but from himself. Their story reminds us that second chances are precious gifts, not to be wasted. That love can grow even in the coldest soil if we're brave enough to tend it. That the people we overlook may be the very ones we need most. And that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not leaving when we're hurt, but staying and demanding better, from others and from ourselves. Eleanor bloomed where she was planted, but she did so on her own terms. She transformed Ashford Hall not by changing who she was, but by refusing to diminish herself. And in doing so, she gave James and his children the greatest gift of all, the chance to become the family they were always meant to be. If you've been listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening. I want to know how far Eleanor's story has traveled, and whether it has touched your heart as deeply as it has touched mine. Remember, dear listeners, you are never only anything. You are whole, complete, and worthy of love and respect exactly as you are. And sometimes the greatest love stories are not about finding someone who completes you, but about finding the strength to complete yourself, and then choosing to share that wholeness with another. Until next time, may you bloom wherever you're planted, and may you always know your worth.